Yeah, I think so.
Is that what you need?
Okay,
Okay.
that's not a bad thing.
No, not a bad thing at all.
I got 'em.
Are you coming back?
They were happy to see the in
So
charge
you're
of-
good.
of
Sure.
the grant.
Yes.
Right, you're right. You just reminded me.
Until you all leave us alone and we'll go through what you need to do.
Oh my
And we're perfectly
Take a
fine.
nap.
We do sleeping.
Yeah, but. So, okay, I think we can get started. Why don't we go around the table and say who's here and then go to the phone and then go to outside? I guess I should say, let's call the meeting to order. It's 12 past 2.
John Meseroff.
Nicole Field.
Sean Scully.
Lancelot, BOE.
It may be a good idea to acknowledge
Oh, sure.
whatever affiliation you have.
Sure. Representing the chair of the energy.
Thanks, Sean.
And this is Nicole Steele again. I'm the Executive Director of Grid Alternatives, representing the solar industry.
Sean Scully from Washington Gas, representing the gas utility.
Lancelot from BOE.
Ted Tribune with DCSCU.
Kirsten Williams, Vice President of Government Affairs for AOBA, and I'm representing the building management sector.
Welcome.
Right.
Just in case people don't know who AOBA is, what does AOBA stand for?
Thank you for that. It's the Apartment and Office Building Association.
Terrific. Welcome.
Donna Cooper representing the electric utility industry, PEPCO.
Betty Ann Kane, Public Service Commission.
Tommy Wells. I don't know if ex officio is the right term. I'm not a voting member of the board, but I attend the meetings as a support to the board, and of course, director of the Department of Energy and Environment.
Great, thank you. So I think just from the folks at the table, we have a quorum. But why don't we see who's also on the phone as well, please?
I'm Dan Weatherburn. I'm Bill Hamilton.
Welcome, Dan.
From the OPC.
Okay.
Welcome, thank you.
And Lenny Berliner, representing the Economic Development Committee.
Thanks, Lenny. Is there anyone else on the phone? We got a good quorum, or a good group. So let's go around the room, introduce ourselves.
Marshall Joe Balkins, DOE.
Alex Lopez, O-Power Oracle. Ricky Grax, O-Power Oracle.
Dan Flaherty, Service Commission.
Marcus Walker, PCSU.
Patty Boyd, PCSU.
Great, thank you. Okay, so want to take a look at the agenda, please, and if there are any additions? I think I wrote in the minutes that I wanted to bring up a couple of things. It's not a big deal, and it could be an open matter. So all I was going to say was that one thing that was striking me when I was reviewing the August minutes is it would be helpful to get the minutes before getting the draft agenda, because sometimes we say in one meeting, we'd like to do such and such in the next agenda, but then if you don't see the minutes to remind you, then you don't know when you're looking at the agenda.
We recognize that we're internally. We recognize that we're not getting you the minutes when we wanted to get them to you, and just had some scheduling issues of we like to vet them before you get them, and duly noted, and that our practice is to get them to you before the agenda, and our apologies.
Oh, okay, great, no, thank you. I didn't know we were starting a new procedure, so that's great. Because a couple of things have been running items, so one had been the identification of barriers, but now that's on here, so that's good. And then also the question about the receipt of the monthly expense information. I don't know if you guys generated, or it gets generated monthly or quarterly, but I think we were behind on a couple of those, and that's not on here either, so I'd like to put that be a running agenda item.
That who's reporting
Yeah, it's going to be recorded. We didn't put it on this agenda today, but we sent it around because we just had a discussion 2 weeks ago, and we haven't had a new invoice, so to speak. But we can put it on the agenda for every meeting moving forward. An update on the expenditures.
Okay, that'd be
And-
great.
And because there's no discussion from board members, we assume that's a unanimous ascension to the motion to add a repeating agenda item for the board. Correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. So that was it for me on agenda.
Madam Chair,
Yes,
just as a matter of clarification, and I apologize because I was not here at the last meeting when that was probably discussed. So you would want a report on the monthly expenditures of the SCU that would be different. Would it be different from the monthly report that you currently receive on our expenditures?
yes, we spent a lot of time discussing in the last meeting and then also several meetings ago. You know, when we were trying to figure out, as we've been talking about, the difference between the expenditures on administrative or internal expenses and the expenditures that go outwards towards incentives to homeowners and or to subcontractors. And we found that I guess it was the invoice that was helpful in tracking that information. And we had talked about having that as a recurring item so that we're able to, whether or not we actually have to discuss it, I think we ask that we see it in advance and then we have the opportunity to discuss it. We also talked in the last meeting about having an actual discussion as to an understanding as to why the split is greater than 50-50 in terms of internal versus external expenditures. So the discussion is still something that's pending, but the keeping on top of it would be recurring.
So, what would you want to have produced in advance of the meeting? Would you want to see our latest monthly invoice?
For clarification, my understanding, this document comes from our team.
Yes, we have a copy of it in the folders, so we do provide that update. It's in the Dropbox on a monthly basis.
So we're not asking the SCU to do anything different.
Okay, that's all I'm trying
That
to.
this report comes from our team.
Well, it depends. If you're getting at the heart of Vicky's question, internal versus external, all we have are the line item categories, but we have never determined exactly which one of those categories were spent internally versus externally. For
Okay,
example,
so I just want to be clear so that the board is not confused as we were confused in the past, so the board knows what they're getting. We agreed that we are getting a report from my shop. We have not created the expectation that you're getting anything different from the SEU. So Ted has offered or is asking for clarification. Is there something different to be provided by the SEU so that we don't get into confusion areas where we've been before? Both of these folks will need clear clarification of what's being expected of them. Now, if it's an issue of the characterization of the expenditures, then that is a reason to have it on the agenda so that those questions can be asked.
Correct.
Is this an internal or external? Why this is? And you're here to be able to answer that. I don't know if the board has asked for a characterization of the expenditures other than what you've already been providing them.
I believe the board has. So, and I think in the August minutes, there's the extensive discussion between us as to being able to explain essentially the cut between internal and external. And we talked about the good thing and the bad thing. We don't know if it's good or bad, but we'd like to be able to just understand how.
I recognize there's discussion, but there is no direction in the minutes that we're all going over of anything different that I know of in terms of clearly telling the staff of what you expect from them. So going forward so that the board is not frustrated, we need clarity, and a discussion is not clarity. An agenda item is a board action. And so we need, we don't have to go by resolution, but if we just go by discussions, knowing the wide range of discussions we've had, that is a pretty limitless expectation in my experience with the board. It's got to be direct because you've expressed frustration with the documents you're getting. So my request is that you be clear.
Okay, so who is it who generates this document, this orange and green document,
We
this
do.
DOEE?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think when we saw one from before, the board saw one from before that came from DOEE, the board said, oh, that looks helpful because we can see if you add up the line that says incentives and you add up the line that says subcontractor, then that gives you a sense of what payments are external going to incentives and subcontractor, and everything else therefore would not be external. So I'm not capable of doing the math right now on the math, but it looked from the one that we had seen before, and I'm making up the number, but for sake of discussion, it was something along the lines of, let's say, 60% internal, 40% external. I'm not sure I have those numbers right, I probably don't. We then discussed whether or not that's the appropriate split as to how the expenditures should go and whether or not we're getting all we can out of our programs, for example. We don't know, is that a bad thing or is that a good thing or none of the above? And you and I had some back and forth and said we'd just like to explain. I'm here a rationale or an explanation as to why is it that the minority of the expenses would be external, seemingly going towards more provision of incentives to homeowners to put solar panels on the roofs or to subcontractors to do the installation than internal. So I'm recommending that the board receive a walkthrough or an explanation as to some of the theory behind why is X% internal and Y% external. And that would be an agenda item. It might be helpful to have that in our next meeting, prior to our writing our annual report. In addition, it would be helpful for us to receive these documents on a continuing basis prior to the meeting and leave as an open space on the agenda whether we would want to discuss the document or not. But I don't know that there'll be a need to discuss the specific document every month.
So just for clarification, are you indicating that the information that we are receiving is sufficient, that we're getting from the Department of Employment? I'm not saying employment, my brain is on that from today, from the Department of Energy and the Environment. Are you asking for something supplemental?
I am not asking for
Exactly.
anything supplemental for the moment except a narrative or an explanation,
Okay.
some more discussion on this document. So I think it's helpful, but I don't know. Yeah.
Vicki, so you're referring specifically to on this, the numbers, the third or fourth line, third endpoint. One says incentives, one says subcontractors. We're making an assumption those are the external
Correct.
expenses, and that everything else is internal or administrative with the programs that are. And I guess my first question to Lance, I guess, is that a correct assumption? In general?
No.
No.
And that's the point I
Okay.
was waiting to
Okay.
get to, that this requirement here would require some further understanding, starting with the definition of internal versus external costs. To give you an example, the line that says subcontractor that you're looking at,
Yes.
the DCS, you have teaming partners that assist with management and compliance of the overall operation. But they're subcontractors of the DCSU because the relationship exists through a contract.
Right.
So while you're doing internal work, I don't want the board to construe that that's an external payment because
For
you see a lot
example,
of
the
this
contract with George Nichols Associates. That would
exactly.
be a
George would be
subcontract.
paid through a subcontractor line. So we would really need to break these things down further with the DCSU to understand the split between internal and external, and it starts with defining what those things are.
Clarification is the line that says incentives, that's all external.
Yes, but incentives can also be paid through subcontractors. So it's again understanding the operation, because the subcontractor might be doing work in the home, and the homeowner will ask for that incentive to be paid directly to that subcontractor instead of check going to homeowner and then homeowner.
So it would show up in the subcontractor line, not the incentives line?
It would show up in the incentive lines,
Oh.
but it's incentives that are paid through a subcontract. So you'd have to look at the invoice clearly and split these things out to make sure you're tracking the cost correctly.
There's one issue that I want to raise, kind of research my distant memory backs going back to 2010. But since we're almost end of year, and I'm looking at the expenditures here, and we don't have it for August and September, but have we fixed the problem of getting to the end of the fiscal year and not spending? Again, I'm just raising the issue. I don't necessarily think we need to discuss it, but maybe in a subsequent meeting. Because I see that the expenditure to date is about 10.8. So my recollection is that the budget is larger than that.
We believe that with the change of the contract
Yeah.
and the change of legislation, that by going to a multi-year contract that allows variable expenditures, that we've corrected that idea. And for the new board members, the SU was kind of hampered because they had to get all their work done within our fiscal year to get credit for it, which meant that you couldn't do a big project that lapsed into another year. So it kept them small, or playing small ball. Apologize for the metaphor, but that was the way to do that. So we believe that has been fixed so that they can have variable amounts. John, I think we've got it fixed.
Okay.
Anybody want to add anything to that?
No, that's good.
I think that means just carry on the money, they can go to the next year, it doesn't have to be spent.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's technically called carryover money. It may be. I get confused with what.
It just says it goes without implementation.
Yes.
So you don't have that pressure to have to spend it.
Right.
And that was something the board asked for.
Yeah.
Right.
The
Exactly.
new members, it was something specifically the board asked to have changed in the legislation.
Exactly.
I apologize for being late. I was under the impression it was 2:30. Excuse me.
And you're to bring it back.
Yes. Let the record reflect, Sandra Matabu-Bry has joined us. Thank you, People Council. Okay, so then back to whether or not we're seeking anything supplemental. I mean, this is the kind of, I think, discussion that I thought that we would be having when we had the discussion on the document. And again, please just try to recall that this goes back to articles that were public, etc., about administrative expenses being incurred by the SEU, or expenditures, being made on administrative matters, and then the question as to whether or not that is going to be impeding or consistent with facilitating the SEU's mission. And we, the board, I think, are trying to assist in ensuring that the expenditures are being intelligently done so that we can make sure that we're getting the bang for the buck. If we aren't asking the right question because we don't know, it's kind of a, like proving the negative here. I may not be asking for the right document, and if I'm not, then, help me out and tell me where it is.
And that's a great point. That I think this is an extremely important area for the board. What I'm trying to be sure is that we're not just providing reports for individual members, that we're providing reports for the board to create a dialogue so that there's distinctions and definitions that everybody agrees on. So one of the things that I think eventually we're going to have to unpack, is what Lance was getting at, is that what does external mean, and what Betty Ann was getting at, what does external expenditures mean, because that's kind of an inelegant term, and what are internal expenditures? I know, we can let Ted speak for himself, but I know he has staff members that have to be able to put together a deal that says, if you buy this HVAC system, if you do this, if you do that, we can get you a certain level of savings, and you can participate in our program with these rebates and these investments, and this fits. Now, to have staff on board that have the capacity to figure this out, is that an external expenditure because it's a staff member, or is that an external expenditure? It doesn't happen without Ted having that person on staff to figure it out. So,
Just kind of almost part of it.
right.
That service.
And usually, as you know, Betty Ann, that there's program costs, whether it's paid by someone in your agency or outside of your agency, and then there's admin costs. You know, that's one distinction. The fact that part of the program is operated from inside is kind of what Lance is going through. This mix that you can get in the same program between the expenditure being internal and external for the same project gets confusing. But that explains why we need to have this conversation, because when an outside critic says, look how much money they spend on themselves, and only this amount went to external folks, they're obviously just enriching themselves.
Correct.
But if you compare it to the Maryland program, where they primarily work on rebates, you can buy into external, internal. Rebates clearly appear to be internal, external. But what we've asked SCU to do in the new contract is to go big, which is staff, when they explain to us their plan, call these things whales that they want to get for us. I don't know if there's anything politically correct about hunting whales.
Not yet.
But,
I think we could use
I
that.
expect that what the board needs, and what you're getting at, Vicki, is a breakdown of what that means. Because we can't be compared necessarily to Maryland, but we do know that the EMV report from Tetra Tech did compare us to other states. In general, we know that in general, we're in the ballpark or better. That's apples to oranges, I think, was Donna had said to us last time. So with that, I don't want to shy the board away from the discussion of expenditures at all. Just want to guide it.
Thank you. So I don't know how to fix it or solve it, except maybe, I guess, to hear.
Well, all of
what
you
you're
guys
saying.
are involved in budgets. I mean, the talent around this table is reflected in what this board's supposed to be. You guys know the questions to ask. You're the best we got.
And if I can also add, the board used to have various subcommittees. I think what you're asking was spot on, but it requires a working session to be able to understand all of the pieces on how they relate to the invoices and how we track expenditures. So maybe a few either working groups or meeting of the whole with the board where we're addressing just this issue for maybe an hour or two, because it does require a deeper dive to get there. And I do also want to add that we did spend quite a bit of time making sure we have common understanding with the DCSU around what we call general and administrative costs. The new contract imposes a cap on general and administrative costs. So we defined what administrative costs are versus what program costs are, so that we can track those numbers correctly to make sure that they're not going over the cap. And if you're looking at this spreadsheet that we circulated with the expenditures, the gray lines towards the bottom of the spreadsheet, for example, shared services, general and administrative costs, that's the 20% cap that I'm referencing. It is something that started, as you can see, in the month of May, after we signed a new contract in April, to make sure that at the end of the year, when we're tracking that line, it doesn't exceed 20% of the DCSU budget for that given year. It is also important to note that we made some changes, as you can see, the way we used to track it prior to the imposition of this general and administrative costs. So core services support costs is something that would no longer appear in the invoice because those costs have been recategorized, so to speak, to make sure they're consistent with the new definitions. So while we're trying to do this dive into the invoices, we need to understand that we do have an existing document in the contract that defines what administrative costs are and what program costs are. And we can still go forward with the internal versus external.
Right. So just one recommendation, and also once again looking for some level of guidance as well, a little bit from Mr. Treview, which is that with certain categories that Chairman Kane just identified, is there a way at least that we can get some proactive type information around what those categories actually are comprised of? When we talk about getting into committees and drilling down a little bit further, can we get some subsets of how those areas are truly defined and what makes up those respective areas? That's deeper than, for example, if I look at subcontractor and I look at incentives and we talk about external versus internal and there are certain levels of overlap, can there be a deeper dive as it relates to providing information to the board as it relates to how each of those areas are defined and comprised?
Sure, I believe so. Dr. Cooper, I think if you were looking at incentives, incentives could go out in at least a half a dozen or more different programs.
Correct.
So clearly there would be an opportunity to show the board, you know, their incentives for large commercial buildings, their incentives for multifamily buildings, their incentives for different types of programming that we're doing, their incentives for renewables.
Right.
And the like, and you're saying that you're seeing that at a more of a macro level.
Correct.
But you're asking for
On a more micro level.
Sure.
And then also just one follow-up question as well. When you talk about administrative costs that are associated with any particular program, and then you may have the subcontractors, and you may have administrative costs that are related to the actual SCU, is that maximum threshold of what it should not go over a combination of the administrative costs for each of those entities, so it's combined?
Yes, it is. And,
Okay.
and even further to the point you made, we have what is called project listing, even a brief description of each of the projects. So when the invoices come in and you see the line item charges, they'll point to a specific project with a project code, so we know that, you know, this incentive is for the commercial or this incentive is for low income. So all of that do exist, and we can provide that information, of course, with the tutorial for the board to be able to understand that. Even for the subcontractor payments, it breaks down administrative costs versus programmatic costs, so to speak.
I am not averse at all. I mean, I'm fine, happy with the subcommittee meeting. Would like to do that. I agree there used to be subcommittees. I don't know, there don't seem to be now, but let's have one. I'd like to be on it. Anyone else?
I would.
I would.
Sure.
Anyone not?
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, the purpose of the subcommittee would be to
Get the
do
deeper
the
dive.
deeper dive, but it seems to me that it needs to be
Open
given
to
the questions that we've got, maybe just an explanation that would come back to all of us. You know, that would go with it. These are the same categories that on every month, they're the same.
Yeah.
So maybe just, okay, what are the incentives? You know, just and then what are the subcontractors? It seems to be those two areas where zero. But I think the whole board would need that, listing of the incentives, as Ted said, and what was the dollar payout, listing of, what are the subcontracts.
So making
Sure,
it an
and
agenda
you
item
guys
for
have a
one
list
of
of
our
all the
regular meetings?
subcontracts.
Yeah, just so that it's kind of like a guide to the budget. What are the things that are under it? Because we look at sometimes categories and maybe not as transparent. And it seems to be, looking back at all of our discussions, our concern was about incentives, how much was going out in incentives, what portion was going out in incentives, and what was going to subcontractors. Those were the two things. And then what are those subcontractors?
Okay, and we can provide that listing and pretty much immediately, because we do have a full
You have
listing
to break
of
down
all
within these categories.
subcontracts. Yeah, we wouldn't approve a payment on an invoice unless there is a subcontractor go with it once it's being billed on the subcontract line. So we can provide that to you.
Okay, I think that's helpful, thank you. So that would be on a running basis to be seeing that information, but I think we're also gonna have it be accompanied by an opportunity for a discussion for us to do a deeper dive. I think the question for the subcommittee, which thus far is me, Sandra, Donna, John, and Sean, is, are we
You
gonna
can
try?
add me as well, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, and Kirsten, okay. Are we going to try to do this in lieu of or in addition to the next meeting and or before the report is due, the annual report?
I
Or
don't
will
know
we
if
just
it's
not have time?
needed before the report is due, because it's, I would imagine we probably need to spend a lot of time, as most
On
times
the
we
report.
can, on the report.
Okay.
And this is more informational and will guide us prospectively.
Okay. Fine
And
by
as
me.
someone that has not put myself on the committee, like from my perspective, the committee is going to figure out what those things are that we want and ask questions and then report back to the board, to the greater board
Yes.
every meeting. I just want to be clear on like the role of the subcommittee and then making sure that, you know, the full board does receive that information as well.
Sure. I didn't understand that the subcommittee would be necessarily a continuing
That's what
effort
I'm
as
asking.
opposed to.
Is it like a one-time thing to determine exactly what we need? Because if, you know, if Lance is going to provide what we need, do we need a subcommittee?
But I think that it goes more to understanding the categories so that rather than just the definitional, this is what it is, that it would be an opportunity for the members to understand better what is being provided and then perhaps suggest additional information related to that or an additional category or further breakdown. And I also think that it would be subject matter determined. It would be more or less ad hoc. And so once that project is finished, that particular version, that, you know, the committee work is finished, then that subcommittee would no longer be necessary. And then we would go more with what Chairman Kane has suggested in terms of the sort of going definition. We'll have the broad definitions and we'll be able to look at them on a quarterly basis or when they're provided. You know, in the context of the regular meeting.
And I think my question then would be, is this a conversation we should be having as a full board? Because it seems like almost everyone here wants to be part of this conversation.
So my only interpretation is this, is that the ad hoc committee would do the deeper dive and that information would be brought back to the board in terms of the information, the level of direction, and there would be an opportunity for the full board to give input based on the defined direction of that particular ad hoc committee. So you still would yet be able to inform the process. It wouldn't be a unilateral type decision. We would bring it back to the board for input as to whether or not this is the appropriate information for the board to be receiving on a going forward basis.
But I would also say too, that to add to that, per Director Wells' comment, this is something this board's expected. I mean, in light of external questions and articles and things like that. I think it's part of the job of the board.
Well,
so it should come back to the board.
Yes, exactly.
Like, because, you know, like, as a committee is not the whole board, and so, like, which is why I've refrained myself from putting myself on this committee, but clearly this is the conversation that I'm interested in as well. So as long as there's an opportunity to have similar conversation as a full board.
I mean, I guess personally, I would say that everybody is interested in it. We've been talking about this for a long time, inarticulately and not getting our point across. So, I mean, if we're finally getting closer, like, let's just do it all together, you know, in the next meeting or in the one after the report is in, and so that we don't have to do it twice and we can move it along. Because I mean, since we've been talking about this, it's been 4 or 5 months already and still not zeroing in on it. And I'm just concerned that we're not doing our job as the board if we're continuing to figure out the shape of the table.
I'm personally good either way, and I think it can be accomplished either way. I think it's a function of time and the efficient use of time. You know, do we elongate the meetings? You know, meetings are already 3 hours and
Yeah.
frequently don't get through what we have on the agenda. And then if we have another massive, which would be, you know, a fairly extensive discussion on this, we're pushing something else back. But I think we could do it either way. It's just that we need to figure out, you know, what we need, when we need it, and, you know, how to get it.
Should we just vote? Or it doesn't matter to me either.
Or, I mean, if everybody, no one is precluded from participating, so you might have a de facto total representation. That, you know, then it's not technically a committee, but it would be, I would suggest that it be a meeting specifically for that and not include any other agenda items.
Right.
Maybe that's the answer then.
And understanding the budget.
Yeah.
And
That would probably
As
only
we go
take an
into
hour.
fiscal year.
Okay, so why don't we do that then? A meeting dedicated to understanding the budget.
Well, I do want to make sure we call this correctly. These are the expenditures. This is not the budget. It's a separate document. This is,
Expenditures.
yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Okay.
Yeah, this is not expenditures versus budget.
Yeah, because the budget is a very fluid document. CSU will change from month to month basis, so.
Okay, and since our report is due in October 12th.
Well, these are 2017 expenditures, and of course, as noted, the categories in some cases changed too, starting with the new contract. And our report's on 2016.
Right. I was just saying that since the report is due, we'll be busy until October 12th, then the meeting after that.
Meeting after that.
Please. Yeah. Okay, that's great. Whew. So we're still on the approval of the agenda. So that was to add that this item, like the check-in or the opportunity to check in on the expenditures on a recurring basis of the agenda, but we may not necessarily have questions if we don't add that to the agenda until after our session. Okay. I have nothing else on the agenda. Anyone else have anything on the agenda? Okay. So I guess we take a motion to approve the agenda.
I move to approve.
Thank you. Any second?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Okay, thank you. Agenda's approved. Moving on to the review and adoption of June and August 2017 minutes. I don't know if the bubble didn't seem to come out in my comments. I think I had a couple of questions in here, but I don't know if they translated. Were there any edits to the June?
Yeah, we did make one minor edit where we tried to clarify what Lenny was saying based on the comment that we received from him. But the highlights were things that were highlighted in the markup copy that you sent over to us, but there weren't any questions. So we kept the highlight in just to get a sense of what questions you had about those sections that were highlighted.
So it looks like there may have been an issue with, the comment bubbles didn't translate or something, or any questions or comments.
No, and I believe this was the PDF you had sent over back to Lenora, and Lenora took the highlighted sections of the PDF and we just highlighted it in Word, and then tried to print it here to get a better sense of if there were still questions regarding the highlighted sections.
That's possible, but I think that would be certainly possible. I don't know what my questions were because I thought I had bubbles and comments and margins. So. I think the heck with it. Let's just go to approve it.
I'm going to approve the June meeting, the August, June minutes. Minutes.
Minutes, please. As they were, I don't remember what the questions were.
Right. Without the highlight.
Correct. And then when they move to approve the June minutes. Betty just did. Okay, thank you, Betty. Thank you. And all in favor? Aye. All opposed? Any opposed? Okay, great. On to the August minutes. I did send some comments there. I think that some of the things were just notations for us to talk about, like getting the Dropbox instruction, which we now have in our folder. We have a discussion of the expenditures information on a monthly basis. We just had that discussion. I raised already the issue of getting the minutes for the agenda. We took care of that. There's a calendar invite. And I think those were the only, those were the sort of ministerial things I just had as notes to myself. But I did just have a couple other edits, like suggesting that other attendees on the front page that we have affiliations provided. And Lance, do you want to say what changes were made to these minutes? Or
Yes, we did put in those affiliations, as you can see from the front page for our attendees. BOE folks have quite a lot of people attending here, but we did put it in. And as you mentioned, the others, the instructions to the Dropbox were sent email, we printed a hard copy, and it's also in Dropbox. We did a quick search today. I think thus far, only about 3 people who have access to the Dropbox have not actually accessed the Dropbox. Marshall did a pretty decent job of explaining how Dropbox works. So once you have a Dropbox account on your computer, it wouldn't be a case of creating a different Dropbox. You would simply be logging in and accessing these files from that same Dropbox account. And so that has been sent around to the board, and again, instructions are there. If you have any further technical issues, please feel free to give us a call, and we'll try our best to walk you through to make sure we can access the documents. And then, as Vicky noted, the comments were already taken into consideration. We will try to get the minutes out before the draft agenda that is sent to for comment, and then we'll make sure that we do have a meeting scheduled for the 22nd. We have put a save the date for the 22nd. I think today's discussion will determine if we are indeed keeping that meeting date on the 22nd.
Okay, correct. Thanks. Okay, so then it looks like the others were incorporated. And then Lenny also had a comment, I believe, that she sent in by email this morning. Lenny, are you there? It was about, I can't find it.
Something about it.
It was about being half of Maryland's budget or half of DC's budget. I'm not able to get my. Does anybody have Lenny? Lenny, are you still there?
She said the last paragraph on page 4 with the CSE has incentives equal to half of its budget, nothing there.
Says is the DC SEU that has incentives equal to half of its budget.
Last paragraph.
Okay.
Page 4.
So yeah, it looks like the last whole sentence on page 4. This Berliner noted that DC had a very peculiar program with incentives for budget.
And I think she's referencing comments she made at the last meeting here, but I'm not sure if she did refer to the SU of having incentives equal to half of the budget. Again, DCSU can clarify that so that we're certain when we're tracking the numbers, because I don't believe incentives total to half of the 20 or 19 million budget. So I want to make sure that as Vernon was clear on the statement here.
Well, if she's saying it was her statement, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the SEU So
Or,
I think,
or that it's factually.
right, so I think we should, correct, right, factually accurate, so I think we should just transcribe what Ms. Berliner says she said. And would that change?
I just had one comment on page 3 of 9, last paragraph, where it indicates that we submitted comments that were very high level and not overly significant. Not sure whether I said overly significant or whether it was not detailed, because what I noted is that we addressed customer data and privacy, which we addressed to the DCSEU board previously. So I wouldn't say that it's not significant. I'm not sure what I said means significant or not, because obviously customer data and privacy are very important. So that were high level, not overly detailed, but we did address customer data as well as privacy. So just how it's presented.
We're holding you to your comments, even if you don't know what they were. We're holding you.
All right.
So what's your correction?
No, I was just indicating that we submitted comments that were very high level and not overly detailed, as opposed to significant. And one spoke to customer privacy and data. Some were forward thinking. So just striking that and putting it detailed.
Just one correction on the very last page, Councilman Allen's name is spelled out. Next. Right at the very end.
Did you guys get those? Did you have those?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So, you can generate those changes, please?
Yes, certainly. We can hit the reprint button before we get out of here today, so that you have it officially approved before you leave.
We can approve them now with an understanding that those changes were made, right?
Okay.
Okay, so, anyone moving to approve?
Oh, I'll move to approve. I'll move to approve the August.
Thank
I
you.
will second.
Thank you, all in favor? Any opposed? Thank you. Okay, great. Update on drafting the report. I think this was an opportunity. I don't know if anybody has any comments or has anything to raise with regard to any sections we may have drafted to share or anything to discuss. I know what we did want to talk about was whether we had any questions for the EMB drafters, Tetra, so that we would know whether or not we were going to have them come. And I had a couple. I don't know if others have questions as well for them. Did anybody have a question for that?
Well, not about that, but I have a question broadly. This is a FY 2016 report. The new contract, was eventually awarded 2017, I guess, but certainly went back into the 60s. So I think we should mention stuff. How do you want to?
Future developments.
The end, again, recommendations for 2017 and beyond.
Right.
Okay.
Both the performance report was on 2016, some of which then will be addressed going forward.
Yeah, I mean, the idea from my perspective, executive summary, is to provide the casual reader who might not read the whole report sort of a sense of what is in the report and what's to come. So, and again, everybody can pitch in terms of what they think ought to be. That's just one of the issues to keeping the macro perspective. Right? end of the original contract, beginning of the new 5-year contract, and also perhaps talking about DC's ambitious goals, writ large that they set for themselves, carbon free, whatever the figures are. The 2050 sets. I mean, it's, you know, again, for whoever might just read the executive summary, capture as much as we can, not make it too detailed. So, thanks.
Great, thank you. My main question, I don't know if it's really warrants any, I certainly don't think it warrants anybody traveling into town. I don't know if they were thinking of Skyping and being available, but was that I was still just trying to understand in the comparison to Maryland and Virginia, there is a discussion in the hearing report about the different programs. I wasn't necessarily getting a sense that there was a discussion as to how Maryland and, I'm sorry, Pennsylvania and Virginia, how they differ from DC in terms of,
Correct.
Are there, DC has great energy usage by the commercial sector, so the savings should be less expensive to achieve maybe than farmland. And so how does DC compare to Pennsylvania? I didn't get a sense of that, so I'm still not quite clear on the utility of these comparisons.
So we can ask for more detail there, and we have some comments on that section as well, which I can put into an email. For one of the examples, one of the individuals who has more expertise in this area noted that in evaluating the DC programs, because you're utilizing the societal cost test, and it also has what is defined as more lenient type assumptions than the underlying assumptions that's utilized in Maryland, which is a total resource cost test. So once again, it's not apples to apples, and you can look at the actual methodology. So we're comparing program portfolios in the aggregate. You're not looking at a program by program basis. So we could put together some questions to ask of the Tetra Tech as it relates to how they looked at this, and it leads to various distinctions as well. So we could put that in writing and just ask those questions. Because we would need their model in order to replicate the results that they actually yielded, and we don't know that. Yeah.
And if I can provide just a brief preliminary statement when it comes to acquisition costs. Acquisition costs is simply taking the amount of energy savings that's reported and taking the amount of dollars spent to achieve those energy savings. It's a simple division to determine exactly how many dollars you're spending either per kilowatt or per megawatt hour savings that you're achieving. It doesn't get into any of the program specifics because, as noted earlier on page 6 on the discussion about acquisition costs in the first paragraph, it's really difficult to make an apples to apples comparison because you have different policies, different programs, different requirements. So it's kind of somewhat hard to judge which is the better program simply by looking at acquisition costs. What this information is very helpful for the DCSEU and for us in terms of planning to understand that if we expect the DCSEU to achieve a certain level of savings, then they may need to reduce the amount of incentives that they're putting on the table or their spending that you're doing overall to be able to hit that amount of savings that's taking place. If you take a look at the chart that's displayed on the top of page 8, that's essentially top of page 8 in the EM&V report. This chart. This chart shows you where the DCSEU landed for 2016, where they were spending roughly $167 for every megawatt hour saving they were achieving. Now, if they want to hit the targets in FY17, the full target, then that number needs to come down to roughly $157. So it provides that kind of information and guidance to the program folks on how to, tune things a bit from one year to the next to be able to achieve the necessary savings. But it would be extremely difficult for us to go program by program, jurisdiction by jurisdiction to try to compare to see who is performing better from an acquisition cost standpoint.
I think that it's important to put in our report an explanation of that, and why it's not possible or reasonable to do an apples to apples comparison. both for the council and for the general public and for the media when they inquire, because that's the
Right.
first thing they say.
And I have included a draft in the section that I was writing, and
Okay.
then we could flush it out a little
Yeah.
bit better, but being able to indicate why there are differences and the different factors and variables that contribute to it.
I
And
think
so-
that's really helpful, because I guess my other kind of question for them would have been, is comparing acquisition costs a useful evaluative tool?
Well, it's not a measure we require per se of the DCSCU. Again, it's just for informational purposes, because there's not a benchmark that's tied to any of these acquisition costs. What we do know is that year over year, the amount of savings become progressively harder, which means that they have to keep driving those costs down. But if this number, as you can see, it goes up and go down from one year to the next, it doesn't really result in us taking significant action against the DCSU in terms of not meeting the benchmarks. It tells the DCSU what they need to do internally from a spending perspective. But you're right, there isn't much additional utility that comes out of this exercise besides just giving a baseline understanding of how you can compare one jurisdiction or program to the next.
So is that a worthwhile discussion to ask Tetra Tech whether or not the tools that they rely upon, primarily the acquisition costs and the realization rates, are the best tools to evaluate, especially as the contract is now going to change so dramatically that maybe next year's report might be using different tools? I personally do not find these tools very illuminating for me, but I mean, I'm a simple.
Yeah, so the question is, Master said that the acquisition cost is not on benchmark, right?
No, it's not.
But we've got minimum targets up there. And
Yeah.
those are targets in megawatt hours, right?
Exactly. Those are the
Not targets
benchmarks.
in cost. We don't have a cost.
Exactly. It will tell you how much you need to spend to
me,
achieve those
yeah,
levels
I
of
think
savings.
that would be a useful discussion with Tetra Tech in general as to what are they evaluating and how are they evaluating. Because if they're making comparisons, say acquisition costs, it's not something that we've set up in a contract or DOE has set up in a contract as a goal or a benchmark. It's not, if they're comparing us to Maryland and Pennsylvania, which are very different demographically, et cetera. I mean, you can do utility scale road projects where you can do residential is 15% of our load here. That's very different from the profile of an average of either of the states, for example. So it is different. So, and yet when you have comparisons like that in a report that becomes public, it's very easy for the public to say, gee, they're spending so much more and not getting the same result. Or they're spending a lot less and getting a good result. You know, it's that's the question is what are they, are the things that they're evaluating things that the DOE and the board thinks are important, and are they useful
I do think that it
before
could.
they start their next evaluation?
Yeah, it is kind of a standard for EM&B to do that sort of analysis. It's just how kind of you get to it. Just pointing out a regional comparison isn't actually very helpful. You look more at a either comparable demographic, climate zone related area that is also doing this, a metro area that's probably could be in the Pacific Northwest because that's in the same climate zone and it might have a better demographic like Portland, Oregon. We don't know, but just looking regionally doesn't really help. You know what I mean? It's like what is the potential savings and then the demographic makeup is actually probably a better comparison.
But it's counterintuitive in the sense that you would think that the neighboring jurisdictions would be more similar, but you know for a fact that they're not.
And I'd also say, and it can be very different for the gas savings versus the electric savings. So you could actually have a different comparison in jurisdictions to the gas savings versus the electric savings in some context.
Definitely. And one of the things we did subsequently when this presentation was first made, Director Wells asked Tetra Tech a question in terms of the national average. And they went back to the ACEE report to determine how the DCSU's acquisition costs stacked up against the national average. These numbers in the report from Maryland and Pennsylvania, they are self-reported numbers. So there's no methodology involved per se other than looking at the amount of savings Maryland is reporting versus the amount that you're spending. And again, you do the math to determine how many dollars you're spending per megawatt hour. So it's the same way ACEEE would gather this information on a state by state basis in terms of looking at acquisition costs.
I will tell you, regulatory utility community, many of the state commissioners have questions and concerns about how AC does its numbers and the comparisons they make.
Well, that's good to know too. I mean, but also that ACEEE looks at a number of, does a number of comparisons.
Yes.
So there are
Yeah.
things other than acquisition costs that they look at.
Yes.
What is the
Yeah, I
percentage of
wasn't
energy
specific.
savings? No, but my point being that when we're saying to Tetra Tech, what is it you're evaluating? If they were going to land on anything out of ACEEE, I don't know if that was the right one to land on, right? As opposed to other metrics that even ACEEE uses. So I guess the question then is, I think what we're all saying is that the comparison with Pennsylvania and Maryland might either be not very illuminating or potentially misleading. So are we looking for, since it's a final draft, and I don't know if there's room for this in the contract or not, any supplemental language from Tetra Tech to explain why it isn't apples to apples necessarily, so that the reader will be able to make their own interpretation as to the conclusions drawn, or would we be supplementing it with further explanation ourselves in our annual report, which is fine, which might be the most expedient.
Yeah, I think that's probably would be kind of quick, because I don't know, this is the final report, so it's done, right?
Yeah, and they did provide this same kind of explanation here in the first paragraph that we're talking about as to what this information should be used for. So if there's something additional to this paragraph that we're requesting, then we can certainly ask Tetra Tech to provide. But it kind of summarizes what we're talking about here, why the programs are different. For example, the DCS, you have a green jobs benchmark, you have a low income requirement, we know the contract has CBE requirements and so forth, so it's difficult to compare these things on a state by state basis.
But that was what I was saying earlier, was that they didn't discuss programmatically what is different, but they didn't discuss demographically, climatically, or, in other ways, whether there are differences or similarities that might also be helpful, and rather than asking DOE to extend a contract or cut a new contract or for them to rewrite it, it might be helpful for us to have an opportunity to just get a couple more of those documented, or a discussion that we can then include in our annual report when we're saying how we're interpreting the NEP.
Okay, or then also, I'm going to suggest that we might want to then give some guidance to
for the next
DOE as to what kinds of things we think would be useful in evaluation. Might, given years of experience with evaluation, might not be appropriately useful.
My question was going to be to what end? So are we then, if we do live in a report, which I think is a good idea, and so then what happens next year? How is that going to be reflected? How are they going to address those concerns? Would they?
And I think that's what Chairman Kane is saying, that maybe we're going to say don't even bother with it until next year.
I think what we might be doing is giving some advice to DOE as to what kinds of things in the evaluation the board thought might not be useful.
And what would be useful?
Would be useful, because you'll do a new contract with them for the 2017 evaluation.
So that was really my question.
Right.
It's a new contract for 2017 evaluation, and that will be reflected in what deals with what the SEU does prospectively.
Exactly, and this type of test, again, it is something that can easily be discontinued because it doesn't take much effort to be able to do an acquisition cost analysis, so to speak. It's just a question of how much utility we get out of it. Are we sending the right messages to folks who may not fully understand all the intricacies involved?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple things to the questions of Rachel. Okay. The first is this point about comparison groups. In fact, comparison groups is a really good point, and it's a tricky thing because usually these data, as Chairman Kim mentioned, is at a state-by-state level, and there is really no other. Not that we're a state in the first place, but there jurisdiction that is only a city and doesn't have any major industry. And those two things make us, in terms of what savings are available to the SCU versus, a state with a large rural population like Vermont, or a state with a large aging and inefficient industrial base like Ohio, for example. It's very different points of comparison. The other thing I would mention on points of comparison is, when can you say demographics in terms of what are the people and what is the industry, but there's also a question of program scale. What level of efficiency dollars have already been spent? Are the so-called low-hanging fruit of energy efficiency in that jurisdiction already picked? Because we track this to see the SCU trying to drive down acquisition costs. But historically, if you look nationwide, very few utilities are able to just continue to drive down acquisition costs forever to a lower and lower and more efficiency point. Because as you do more programs that pick low-hanging fruits like lighting, it often then becomes more expensive, and you do have a U-curve where acquisition costs do actually go up, and that is something that's normal, and we see that in a lot of jurisdictions. If you look at Massachusetts, for example, which is the #1 state, a leader on energy efficiency, they have far, far higher acquisition costs than we do. That doesn't mean they're being really inefficient in their execution of the programs. It reflects the state of their market and what they're doing versus what we can do here. So this is, I think I would just agree, it's a useful metric, but there's a lot of caveats to it, and definitely something to look at.
So can we have, so I think we were talking about having this discussion with Tetra Tech, was it the 22nd?
It was. I think that was Lenny's suggestion, if I remember correctly.
Well, we had talked about sharing the information and getting feedback versus bringing them or a representative here or not.
Right, or doing a
Exactly.
video
Correct.
conference.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think we were taking the temperature today to see if we wanted to even set that up with them. And
Right.
it
I guess
sounds
the
like-
question is, do we need that discussion in order to do the report? Because that's what we're sticking with. To do the 2016 report.
Probably not. And I think that if there's additional detail, and I think Lance, you could be very helpful, and Dr. Lawrence as well on this, but I think we can present it and draft a section on this, as well as get input and additional details from them if needed. Yeah.
So they are off the hook.
Wait.
Oh,
They're not
nope,
quite
no,
off
we're
the hook yet. So because I did commit last go around that I would help with the green jobs section, I obviously focused on that and looked at it very closely. And so I did have a clarifying question for them, and it's in regards to just how the green jobs are calculated. So there's two different ways to calculate it. You calculate an FTE, and that's focused on those who work at the SCU and their subcontractors, and then there's a metric used to essentially just divide $200,000 because that's essentially what the federal government thinks it costs to create a full-time job, through incentives. And so my question is I wanted to make sure that we that the jobs that were counted in the subcontractor side of things wasn't also counted in the calculated incentive calculation. And so that's the thing that I sort of took away from that. Like, I just want to make sure that we're not double counting, but you don't have that extra information to be able to just make sure. And I think as somebody who was not a subcontractor last go around and received incentives, we still had to report as if we still had to report our jobs as if we were a subcontractor. And so I was curious to, what that process looks like.
And again, just to provide preliminary explanations here, the incentives that are counted are incentives that are paid what we call upstream incentives or midstream incentives. They're not paid through subcontractors.
Yeah, so they're not considered like a rebate.
No, they're not. Well, you can consider them a rebate depending on how you want to classify it. But to give you an example, if the DCSU works with a manufacturer to buy down the cost of light bulbs, when the light bulbs get to the store, to the distributors, and then the residents and businesses purchase, they're getting a discounted price because the DCSU paid for that option. That direct payment they made to that manufacturer is what we would count as incentives dollars. So it wouldn't be a part of any incentives that is paid to our subcontractors who are doing work on a home or a business, because that would be captured through the hours that are reported by that subcontractor and their employees.
Okay, and that was the clarification I was looking for. I guess it's just not clear what is lumped into the incentives bucket. This goes back to our incentives conversation.
What's in there? What's in the
What's in
incentives,
the
what's in
incentives bucket
subcontractors?
versus what's not.
So do you need anything further from them, from Tetra Tech?
Based on Lance's explanation, I think I'm comfortable. But I think a recommendation board would just be helpful to know what the incentives, what's included in that.
Okay. So then maybe we'll be able to handle our own ability to distinguish the report, and we would request that for a future meeting we have an opportunity to speak with Tetra Tech about evaluative tools going forward. And I think the SDU, you guys have any thoughts as well on, given it's a new contract and the new era, I guess I would invite you all to think about what's a useful reporting tool.
Clarifying question, are you, when you say a Tetra Tech at a future meeting, is that a future meeting happening this month or
No.
future? Okay, because the EMNB, just so everyone's clear, the EMNB contract for the SEU under the current contract is wrapping up. And there would be a new EMNB.
Whoever, I guess, thank you for the clarification. So we would ask for whoever is selected as the EMB provider.
So to just back up a moment for that, is the selection, are the criteria that the provider would be providing specified in the RFP? In other words, is it already done by the time the new person's on board?
The RFE does include some very broad aspects of doing EM&B, like, for example, conducting an impact evaluation and so forth. As part of doing an impact evaluation, you could ask for an analysis on an acquisition cost to be done, or you could not ask for an analysis on an acquisition cost to be done. So yes, we have very broad scope of work spelled out in the RFP, but the level of detail that we get within that those very broad categories are going to be worked out with whomever the evaluator is.
The question is, at what point would advice from the board be useful?
I would say as soon as we can get done with this report, probably October and November, because the RFP closes, right now it's on the street, it closes September 18. If we don't extend it, then we get into an evaluation process and so forth. So we don't anticipate having a contract in place at least till late November, probably early December. So anytime between, like I said, the end of your reporting year and that period, we can discuss some of the things we want to see done from the evaluation standpoint.
Okay. It sounds like that might be end of October after the report in November might be the understanding the expenditure. Okay. Or not necessarily in that order, but yeah, because I saw that it said that this year DOE elected to forego the impact evaluation. But okay. So it doesn't sound like we have immediate questions then for Tetra Tech, and I think we were going to talk also about whether or not there were any questions for the auditor, for the financial audit. A lot of that was Lenny. No longer on the phone. She had been on the phone.
And when did you send it in?
Not to my knowledge. Not that I received. Okay, so did anybody else have questions that they want to pose on the financial audit? Okay, hearing none, then, okay. This is sort of blended the discussion of the board's report. I personally haven't drafted my section. But we now have 5-ish weeks until it's due. So I don't know if we're going to divide into little groups like Sandra. I know you're heading up a big chunk of it.
Right, and I have received documents from.
Okay.
We have. Well, ours is a working. OPC's is a working draft. I do have something. I was going to ask about process. How are we going to do that? Are we sending that? Are we circulating the drafts? Is someone going to be responsible for putting it all together?
I guess that's how we did it before.
Yeah.
So probably, yes. Our meeting on the 22nd now was going to be Tetra Tech and auditor questions. But maybe it should be to discuss drafts.
And is there any value to circulating the individual drafts?
Yes, I believe so, yes.
Wanted to offer the way, the board may or may not find great utility in the Dropbox. That's you all decide, but the way we have set it up, everyone does have editing permissions, so you could also, and ability to add documents, so you could also use that same Dropbox folder to share draft copies and be able to be track changes working on a copy. Obviously, not all, if you want to alter the same copy at the same time, it doesn't work very well. But other than that, it could be used if you wish to do that instead of just sending out emails. That's an email attachments. That's also an option.
At the risk of sounding like the old woman. Incapable technologically in many other areas. I don't know if people have experience with that and if they think it works well.
Isn't it just mark changes with
I think so.
It's not like
I can halfway do it, I'm sure.
All right.
But it does get complicated when people aren't doing it in a certain order. If they're putting their comments into a previous version, that's the problem of having them kind of a master version. That takes some administrative support to do that. Put their comments on the same version. Or just sending in your paragraphs or your section and say, add it in.
So who would we be sending that?
Last year was me.
Well, I guess that's a question for DOE. What kind of
What do we do?
editing support for putting it together into a final version? Is that something that
we can certainly provide it. It's not something that we've done in the past, but we can provide that, collecting all the edits and incorporating them into documents.
Somebody, staff last year put it.
Yeah, I thought someone at DOE.
Yeah, we formatted once you guys have finished drafting, but
Yeah.
in this case, it sounds like we would need to be receiving individual comments and incorporating them into this master document, make sure everyone is tracking.
Well, it seems for the moment like our sections are discrete enough. I can just I'll put them in one document.
Okay, and then we get together on the 22nd, we'll
Yeah.
see what we have, whether it's ready to turn over and say negative 3.
And the 22nd is
Friday.
Friday. So trying to get drafts. Wednesday.
Up to a week of the 8th.
Of the, yeah.
19th.
So shoot for the 20th. All right. Draft on the 20th. Okay, great. Thank you all. So I think we're now on Ted, identifying barriers.
May I ask one point? What time did we decide on the 22nd?
I think it was 10.
10, okay.
And I think DOE, are you guys going to be able to send out a calendar
Yes.
invitation for that?
Yes, we'll send it out.
Yeah, 10.
And it was 10 o'clock?
Yes.
Okay,
And
thank
it's
you.
back to the usual.
Although a different day. Right. Yeah. Okay, so let's do barriers.
welcome John back. Let me say good afternoon to the board and to the staff here. We have, I've prepared a small document that I've not distributed anywhere to kind of talk about this topic and really get started. I want to caveat what I'm saying with the thought initially that if you look at the reports that have come in evaluating our programs and evaluating the success thereof over the last few years, I think it should be noted that we have achieved, with the exception of 1 year, about 3 years ago, all of the performance benchmarks contained within the contract. And so we feel that also if you look at the results over the years, you see a nice, hopefully you see a nice upward trajectory in which the results have been going over the years. So you're having more and more success in terms of energy savings. We're also tracking now not only green jobs by the hour, but looking at full-time job creation. So our workforce development program has moved from one where we were, quite frankly, doing some temporary work to really training people to get into long-term career sorts of jobs. And so the majority of the organization has been demonstrated through the results and that upward momentum that you've seen over the years. Nevertheless, I think, John, as you put it, as we embark upon this new contract, I think it's worthy of noting some of the things that have been challenges in the past, hopefully not to be repeated in the future. And I've broken this into 4 different sections. And some of the things that we anticipate to be challenges in the future, where we will have to work as a group and, you know, inside of the office with our contractors, with you guys to talk about how we potentially overcome them in particularly in the last couple of years of this 5-year contract. So let me break them into basically about 4 different categories. One, clearly let's start with the money, since we talked about money for about an hour to start this meeting. Our base budget on an annual basis is about $19.2 million. If you take a burn rate of about $1.5, $1.7 million a month, that's about where we should be if we were working on a flat burn rate. That has never been the reality of the conditions under which we have worked in any of the 5 or 6 years that we've been around. Due to the federal government shutdown in 1 year, due to some uncertainty about the contract in another year, probably in 3 of the last 4 years, we've started the year with about a $990,000 cap on our monthly expenditures. And when you start the month with a cap of about $990,000, you effectively lose the cooling season, the heating season. So you're talking about starting October with a not a robust amount of money to spend, and then these fluctuations can get into the holidays over Thanksgiving and Christmas, and so we really start to get ramped back up in March, which causes the proverbial hockey stick, as we've talked about it around here. For those of you like Ms. Williams who are new to the committee and may not be familiar with the sports analogy, when we talk about the hockey stick, you ever seen a hockey stick? So our spending kind of looks like this for flat-ish for 5 or 6 months, and then it goes like this. And so in what you'll see like this year is very similar. So you'll see a overheated market in July, August, and September, and because we have this 5-year contract now, so we won't be under the $990,000 limitations moving forward. But then you'd see a market that dramatically cools off in October and November. And I'm sure that many of you have heard, from external stakeholders about, oh my God, it's the boom and bust. It's cyclical nature of the contract and the programs or whatever of their work. And that's why you're hearing this. And so with this new contract, we're very encouraged that you won't see that sort of boom and bust in the programs and a lot of spending in the last 3 or 4 months and very relatively little spending in the first 3 months or so. And so that's one of those things that historically, though, has been kind of a barrier to implementation. Second, I would talk about something that was mentioned here a little while earlier, and it's something with which we have worked with the respective utilities and the Public Service Commission on in the past. And I think it's worth some continued dialogue. It's about our access to utility data. We realize through the energy benchmarking work that's being done by the Department of Energy and Environment that we get a good lens into. Now we do. We didn't have that when we first started, of course, but energy benchmarking. Marshall, when did you guys start doing that work?
The program was initiated in 2015 and started sharing the data with you in either late 2014 or early 2015.
Right. So that started to give us a good lens into some of these larger energy users. As many of you will recall, particularly if you were here around the first 3 or 4 years of the contract, we had this benchmark that said, you have to serve the largest energy users. Who were they? Anecdotally, like I've said many times, we could talk about federal government or Metro or the Water and Sewer Authority. But after that, it gets a little bit sketchier in terms of, is it that building over there, which is the same square footage as that building over there, or is it somebody else? Because we didn't have the sort of optics that now we have that helps us get a view into the performance of some of these buildings. But with 15-minute interval data, it gives you an even deeper dive into the building performance, into the ability to do the analytics, to make the recommendation from an engineering perspective. And I brought one of my top engineers over here, Patty Boyd, to help you really talk about what you can do when you get that 15-minute interval data. I think we showed it to you 2 meetings ago in a slide where we actually did the analytics for a building. And I know it's kind of a messy looking chart, but the smart people know how to go and make sense of that mess and really take a look at that data and how that then helps you talk about with a building operator how they can improve the performance of their building. So that's a second topic.
So are you saying that now that the benchmarking data has been coming in as of 2014, that the problem is resolved, or?
No, we still don't get 15-minute interval.
We get an annual consumption. That's it. How much do they use for the entire year? And some buildings aren't in the benchmarking data. The federal buildings don't have to report. Some hospitals choose not to report. They'd rather pay the fine than have to pay somebody to do this work, because for a hospital it's very complicated, all the inputs that you have to do in Energy Star. So there's several buildings that just simply don't report, but the majority of commercial buildings, office buildings, do. It's relative. But we're only getting an annual number, and it's 1 year or 2 years later.
For the benchmark.
For the benchmark.
To clarify, of course, Ted, the requirement that a certain percentage of the focus be on the largest users, that is no longer required, or is not?
Right, correct. That is now a tracking benchmark. So the way we resolved that was to say that the largest energy users were buildings that were of 200,000 square feet or above. And then we have to track the number of buildings we serve that are in that particular space.
But once you go to a building owner and say we'd like to work with you, there's no barrier to that building owner giving you permission to access their 15-minute interval data.
Right, that is something that we have to go to them individually, and they sign off on it.
They sign off on that. And have you had a problem convincing building owners or managers to give you access to that data once they've been
Not
approached.
typically, usually
They're willing to do it.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's pretty easy. We've set up with Washington Gas and Pepco a kind of a direct line of communication, and we have
They just
a view
give
only
permission.
portal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
But-
it's the
but
issue that you have to ask, and they want to voluntarily give it, but maybe you're saying that if you had a greater glimpse into people's time of use information, then you would know who you would want to go.
As a salesperson.
I'm looking at AOBA here.
Everyone is looking.
Now that we have AOBA, the building owners get represented on the board, you know, whether, that's why I asked whether it is a problem convincing people to participate. Sometimes they participate through an association and an entry portal.
And that's definitely something I can take back. I know overarchingly, the concern is always about sharing that personal data without that customer's approval. I think we all have, consistently, held the same opinion about providing that ability through the SE or any other third-party entity. So if there are opportunities that we can work collectively, I'm happy to connect more with our members if that is something you're having a barrier with in terms of getting that approval.
That's it. Yeah, and this is a commercial discussion. It's not a residential discussion.
Right.
Right.
It's
pretty
I
large
know,
commercial work.
yeah, but I mean, AOBA's got a kind of, we're buying cooperative, we buy the energy
Alliance.
together for groups of buildings.
Right.
So that might be an entry.
Sure, and we do go through the benchmarking data. We just recently had a conversation with Marshalls and others to kind of self-identify amongst our membership who's on that higher end use performance metrics. So that's something.
Because and this morning on NPR was that apparently the Watergate Hotel is so really big. No, I was just going to ask because I'm familiar with Massachusetts programs just because of work I'm doing there, but the energy efficiency programs are run by the utilities, so they already have the data. And I guess I'm wondering about other models that aren't. Are there other models where it isn't the utility that's providing it? How do they get around the data issue?
EBT in Vermont isn't a utility, but they do have access to EBT. Efficiency Vermont, EBIC roads also Efficiency Vermont. And they do have access to.
But it's isn't it under like the office of an agency or is it government?
It's regulated.
Yes.
Which may make it different.
It's a different state law.
It's a different state law.
Yeah.
It's a better state law.
And your concern about the energy benchmarking data is that it's not in a real-time aspect enough for you all to be able to monitor that?
I would say yes. Now, the benchmarking data has many, many good things about it that we are using and working directly with customers. And some customers go, wow, I didn't realize that this building was using more energy than this building. Or, that we're doing a lot of great work with the benchmarking data. But in terms of being able to target the largest energy users, it would be, if we had the AMI data, we could run it through some of our tools, like Ted said, where we could show a heat map of how a building is using energy throughout the day. And we could say, oh, these guys are, they have stuff on 24 hours a day. We can see simultaneous heating and cooling. We can see, there's a lot of things that we can see from the data where we could target this one building over another building, where we're not able to do that right now unless they're actually working with us.
And to add to that, I mean, AMI data is for the most part the electric side of the equation here. We do have that for some larger customers or customers that are on interruptible rates to measure them and to be able to deal with that situation. But that's, you're talking maybe a couple hundred in DC, not the thousands of meters that we have.
Turning to your side of the equation, it's one of the things that we see in our neighborhood over in Southeast where our office is located. All of the new buildings coming online are all electric. We just call it decasification, for lack of a better word. I don't know if it's a real word, but it reduces the amount of opportunities we have to achieve reductions on the gas side. Technologies moving towards all electric buildings.
We have approved the last gas rate an incentive program for Washington Gas for multifamily buildings. And that's done. That's not under recon, so I can talk about it. But there might be an opportunity. We're looking, even still thinking about how to set up our evaluation of the success of that program, or because it was a temporary, short-term authorization, so that we can evaluate it when the company comes back in their next base rate case, whether to continue it, etc. I don't think that's big enough turn to say that there might be an opportunity, because I'm sure Washington Gas would like that to be a success. And the Commission did make a statement that we felt that when we asked for reconsideration, that we were interested in some of the gas appliances were more efficient in some cases than electric appliances, so that there wasn't any reason to say no to letting them try it.
Now, is it that you approved an incentive for the construction of the gas lines, or
that's the expensive part? Yeah, right. And you can talk more about it, but it's sort of a lot of details still being worked out, so it might be an opportunity. That's up to you all.
Yeah, it's usually pretty cost effective to just run the line to the building, just given the amount of units. It's the internal piping.
Yeah.
That's the cost prohibitive. So what the program does essentially is, because when you're doing the cost benefit test of how much revenue is brought in from a customer over a 30-year period, I believe it's a 30-year test. They're very cost effective at that rate, because you basically run one service line to a large multifamily building. In this case, you're saying that an NPV positive amount of money can, to some extent, be put back towards the builder to cover the costs of the internal piping, to get the gas pipes to the individual units. So you can do individual meter versus a central system. So that's generally how the program is designed, and I think you're right in the sense that there might be there's a lot of benefit, I think, to combining that with maybe some of the incentives that you have for new construction, to say, now this really is a potential point to at least look at it from a pilot perspective and say, that does this really work to make the overall building more efficient on an MBTU basis than if it was all electric. But again, it's a good suggestion in that, but it is a brand new program. I mean, it's just approved.
This program will be starting in October, or is it, when will you start this program?
Well, it's approved now. It's available to discuss to builders. I think we're putting together the policies and procedures internally before we kind of go and actually put it in place, because we want to make sure that we're promoting it correctly, tracking it correctly, because there's a lot of ways to track that. You have to track it to go back and evaluate it at the end to the commission.
Can you make sure that we have a discussion and maybe sit down and have a briefing when you guys are ready to roll this out, so we would love to, to work with you guys if there's a way forward, and if there's some synergies there.
Yeah, I mean, we could have that discussion next week to at least talk about the timeline, and have the people that are more the engineers on our side to discuss how they approach the programs, to get people in queues, how they're going to do that. So.
I don't recall, was there a sunset on that program on the pilot?
I can't remember off the top of my head whether we said 2 years or 2 years or the next rate case, whichever. It's a. When we were getting it started, we were talking, a couple of years, seeing how it goes. Yeah.
What's the level of funding that's associated with the program? Is it broken down, assuming residential and commercial?
Just residential.
Residential exclusively.
I believe.
Just multifamily.
Yeah. I do not remember the amount of funding that's approved off the top of my head, but I can.
I'm sure there was a funding number, never, but it's more the savings when you do the 30-year return on bringing the gas there, redirecting some of those savings into the incentives or subsidies.
Into the construction costs.
Construction.
Let me,
You might have
two
two
more
more on your
quickies,
list.
right? And these are coming a couple of years or so down the road, a couple, 3 years down the road, but clearly that's within the span of this current contract. I would just call them changes to code, building codes. What are now, remember, we can only claim the incremental savings that are above code. So as the code changes, it makes the technology to be installed, higher and higher. What we can claim gets smaller and smaller. Give you LED lighting. We anticipate pretty much being code by about 2020. That'd be the 4th year of our contract. Again, these are, just things that we're anticipating. Don't have the exact dates on them yet. But if you ask, what are some of those things that would make this more difficult? That's clearly one of them that I would put in the mix. Patty, give the example of the boiler that you were talking about.
Condensing boiler.
Yeah, the condensing.
Yeah, so a lot of the older buildings, universities, hospitals have very old gas-fired, possibly steam boilers, natural gas boilers that are maybe operating in the 65th percentile. We don't know unless you actually test their efficiency. If they're at the end of life and they're going to replace them, then they must replace them with at least a code boiler, right? So that's 80%, say. If they increase the efficiency, they can get up to 96% sometimes efficiency with a condensing boiler. Well, DCSCU can get between the 80 and the 96. That incremental savings we can claim, where the customer actually sees maybe from 65 or maybe lower. I mean, some of these boilers are really old and really inefficient. They see that entire savings. So we don't get to document all the savings, even though that savings is in existence. We have to go from code and above. And as that 80% gets higher and higher, you're running out of incremental savings that you can claim.
And where is that requirement? Is it in the contract? I mean, the specification of the credit is for the incremental gain.
Oh, that we're only claiming incremental savings?
Yeah, over code.
Over code, yeah. I mean, Lance,
It is. Well, it's not spelled out in the contract per se, but the standard evaluation approaches. For example, in order for the DCSUs to mention the claim energy savings, you could simply just take out a T8 law and put it in a T8 law and try to claim savings for it. It would have to be something that's more above the code for them to be able to claim savings, because code requires that you do a minimum of a T8.
So you can only claim savings for things that you caused to happen.
Exactly.
That's what you're saying. Because if the code changes, and the residential code is changing too.
Yeah. And it goes also back to doing your assumptions for the societal test.
Yeah.
That's how you're going to, what are you going to assume are the savings? You can't assume every boiler out there is 65% efficient. You have to have a baseline assumption. Code usually is, because if it failed and there was no DCSU program, they would have to put in an 80%. So that's kind of your baseline assumption.
We do have a retrofit exemption. So if somebody decides, no, I've been running this boiler forever, I take really good care of it, but I know that if I replace it with something more efficient, I can get more savings, I can get energy savings, but I could keep this one going. We can call that a retrofit. We have to have documentation to show that. You have to take pictures of it to show that it's not really it really is well taken care of, and maybe get a couple photocopies of their maintenance records or whatever to show that they take care of it. Then we can claim from whatever the existing efficiency is. So there is but that's only in retrofit. That's not in new construction or end of life.
So if the DC government had policies like some of the ones outlined in Clean Energy seek to attempt to accelerate the rate of retrofits in the city, and get buildings that would otherwise maybe be waiting another 5 years to do a retrofit today, you could incentivize that whole savings, even if much
yes,
of it
or most of it, or 5 years of it, or something. So we do have in CAP one of our tools that is used to upload all of these savings and put all of our numerical assumptions in. There's a whole section on lifetime of the equipment. So if it was a 20-year lifetime estimated, and you were able to get them to do it in 15 years, you could claim that 5 years of total savings. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So we do that in our custom calculations.
I guess because you are no longer required to do these projects within a 1 year time span, those barriers that my members would face with these larger projects is no longer an issue.
It's helpful, yes.
Very much a barrier removed
Yes.
by this new contract, for which we are eternally grateful.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a big game changer. And the last one, I guess we started with money. We can end by talking about money as well. As all of you know who have been following this, our budget has been flat since 2014. We're entering 2018 a month from now, and our contractors' labor costs go up, cost of materials can go up, et cetera, et cetera. And those factors do, factor into how much money we have to spend on the efficiency program. So, it's effectively fewer dollars that we're able to get out there. But those are some of the 5 things that we kind of thought of on a right. The degasification, I consider that one unto itself. That are some of the things that we're looking at, particularly over the next few years, as challenges that are potentially need to be confronted by the organization.
Thank you.
Things that we're thinking about when we go back and say, how are we gonna hit the goals in year 4, 3, 4, and 5?
I saw one of these barriers in the strategic plan. The savings, but that's helpful. So I think we owe you responses or suggestions.
On the issue of funding, one of the other challenges, of course, is just being able to keep money dedicated to it. Right?
Yes, and not being swept. That's right.
That was a little beyond our control.
Yes, but
it's an exogenous factor, I mean,
and
that happens. That
yeah,
goes
it's
directly
significant
to
when you
your
add
budget.
up all the money. I mean, there was $44 over from this time that SEU started to last year, 2016. They got diverted. It didn't go
But you mean
into the general fund.
the SETF, the actual
SETF money.
Yeah.
Yes. And then also on the issue, I don't know, our earlier discussion about comparing DC to Maryland or Pennsylvania, but there's a lot of tax money that goes into general tax money. There's a limit to how much the rate can be put on the rate base, but they supplement that a lot with just appropriated money and tax money, but for programs that do the same.
We wouldn't have a.
I knew you were going to say that. Yeah, neither would we. Even though it's the same people.
I mean, the city's tax revenue seems to be doing pretty well these days. But that's all I had.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
I think we had old and new matters or updates from Tommy, and Tommy's not here. So I don't know if anybody had anything else. I was just going to say congratulations, DC, first Lean Platinum City. Woohoo! Fantastic. So did anybody have anything else? Okay, so I guess we'll see each other on the 22nd. And I don't know if anybody wants to hesitate over some of the things we heard from Ted before or after that. Some good ideas and drafts that we will exchange on the 20th. And send them to me to compile into some unattractive document. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Actually,
The 22nd is
22nd.
Yes.
Mine is still a work in progress.
Okay, I keep
You only
getting
knew the
them.
hours that I was like, I get on this at like, what time? Midnight? And then I was like, wait a minute, that table, let me check those numbers. Did I reverse the column?
Yeah, I saw that there was
Never.
and then you moved the graph.
Exactly. And then also the convert minimum and pulling the data out of the different. So let me do a fine tooth comb.
So we're just looking at the last one. Whatever you said, that's what.
Yeah, but I'll do a final. But I wanted to get something to you so that.
Yeah, and I was actually, I had some questions. I guess the last version that you sent. The funny thing to talk about.
Exactly. Drill down into that a little bit more, and also some of the information that, technical information sharing.